All right, we're going to get rolling. If you're joining us online, just make sure you let us know your first and last name, the zone you're licensed through. That would be helpful. Couple of reminders. If you want to pay your annual membership dues, Adam will take your $20 for your family annual membership dues. We do have annual picnic and super slide amusement park event coming up here in August. It's the second week of August. So August 13th, Tuesday, August 13th. And that is a membership only event. So you have to be a paid member to attend that event. But I mean, wristbands cost how much? So your membership is really, you're getting your bang for your buck there if you bring a couple of kids to the super slide amusement park, right? Heck of a deal, I tell you what, heck of a deal. So mark your calendar for that. More information to come on the picnic and the event. Tonight, we've got Krisann with us. Again, from Little Lights Pediatric Therapy. I have to look at your shirt to make sure that I'm saying all of the words in the right order. She's going to talk a little bit about self-regulation tonight. She's been here before. Many of you probably have met her along the way with some of your kids. I'm not going to steal your thunder on your intro. I'll let you talk about yourself because I'm pretty sure you do it better than me.
I'm sure not. I shouldn't talk about myself. I don't like to talk about myself. Okay, I'll try and hold this down because I have a loud voice as is. So hi, I'm Krisann. I know quite a few of you already, and for those of you that I don't, thank you for letting me join you. I'm happy to be back. Yep, I've been here before and I love your guys' meetings. So just a little bit about me. I have been a practicing OT for about 15 and a half years. I've owned Little Lights for about 6.5. And we're a private outpatient OTPT and speech clinic here in Bismarck, but we also have a clinic down in Linden, Strasburg, actually, technically, if you want to think about it. So I graduated in 2008 with my master's degree in OT and a special education minor. Since then, I've done some extra training in emotional regulation, behavioral management. I have an autism certificate from UND in 2011. Done sensory. I've done a little bit of everything along the way. I like the joys and flexibility of OT, and I can kind of do what I want to do. For those of you that do know me, I'm not a super formal person, so please feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, or otherwise if you have questions or have something that you want to spew along the way. Are you guys going to flip my screens or my slides? Oh, Leslie's back there. Thank you, Leslie. Okay, lovely. So that's enough about me. So let's move on. So here's kind of our outline for the night. I know some of you know what OT, does everybody know what OT does? Great. I'm sure all of you have dealt with OT at some, so I won't go into very much detail about that, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. What is self-reg? How to spot a dysregulated child, which I'm sure you guys know even way better than me. So sensory processing, the impacts of trauma, and some solutions for some of the sensory concerns that you guys might face. Again, I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions, but if you guys have anything, please feel free to jump in and I'm happy to answer. Lovely. I love the help. Okay, so OT, I always joke that my goal in life and my job in life is to educate people on what OT does because nobody knows what we do. Everybody knows what PT does, everybody knows what speech does, but nobody knows what OT does. So essentially we talk about what OT can do is it's a holistic approach. We treat kids and families as a whole unit. Not just OT used to be the upper limbs, PT used to be the lower limbs. That's not the case. And especially people don't know what OT does with kids. So essentially anything that kids are having challenges with or families are having challenges with, OT can do. There's the formal definition in the slide, so I'm not going to read that and bore you to tears. But it kind of talks about how OTs can help with the sensory, especially the sensory processing aspect, which is huge. I mean, I think if you Google OT, you get sensory processing disorder right off the bat. But we can work on all those things that are challenging a kid and impacting their daily life. So what is self-regulation? Self-regulation is the ability to manage your emotions and behaviors based on the demands of the situation or the experience. It begins from our sensory motor experiences at birth, through birth, and otherwise, and it also deals with the attachment relationship. So really starts from that. They talk about a lot of our sensory challenges, when we actually go back and look at some of the sensory challenges of our kids, a lot of these kids are C-section babies. And so they talk about in the beginning, when we get our first biggest push of sensory input is through the birth canal. And so that's when kids get their biggest push of sensory input. And so some of our kids who are drug addicted, alcohol addicted, or C-section babies, we see a lot more of those challenges with some of these sensory things. So if you go back and look at that, that's kind of a glaring concern that these kids have, is some of them deal with those kind of concerns as well. And it can also be referred to as self-control or emotional control. So they can be used interchangeably. Sometimes the self-control or emotion control is more used in self-regulation. So what is a dysregulated child and how do I know? We've all seen this. I think it's safe to say everybody knows what this looks like and what dysregulation looks like. There is no stranger to this rodeo. So this is what it looks, and this is typically what we see with our kids who are dysregulated. So some of the signs and symptoms of a dysregulated child, these kids that are easily triggered, as we know a lot of our kids are, high energy. These ones are really easy to spot, the kids that are running around and can't sit to save their lives. But also a lot of times the kids that get noticed are those kids that are really angry and have a lot of energy, but the ones that go unnoticed are the ones that have low energy. So this is also a sign of some sensory dysregulation. They can be uncoordinated or clumsy. So some of our kids don't register their sensory input near as well as we typically do. And so these kids can also be challenged kids because they don't register, but this can impact safety and this can impact things as well. So typically we think of the kids in the slide where they're screaming, crying, tantruming, but those low registering kids and those very quiet, low energy kids can also be a sign of dysregulation. Very extreme reactions that are, again, those extreme reactions, the tantrums, the meltdowns that we see frequently, a lot of aggression, poor attention span and poor flexibility. When we look at a lot of our areas for our kids, a lot of it comes down to flexibility. These kids just are not very flexible and they have struggles with structure or not having structure. And they require such structure that they're not able to be flexible when they need to be flexible, which in turn, we all know that life is not a rigid road. We need to be flexible in life. And these impacts have a significant impact for a lot of different areas. Essentially everything that these kids do, their interaction with others. People don't want to be around kids or people that are aggressive, angry all the time, destructive. So they don't interact well with other kids. They don't interact with other people. These are the kids getting kicked out of schools and classrooms and otherwise. Being successful in school, they struggle. There's a lot of sensory things that go, if they're dysregulated, that goes into that as well. A lot of our kids, you guys probably know, don't get adequate enough sleep, which also in turn impacts behaviors and dysregulation. Because if we don't sleep, we don't eat, we don't act very well. And complete their basic like daily life skills, grooming, hygiene, dressing, all the things that they really should be doing as kids should. And then also the ability for caregivers to take their kids out in public. A lot of our families will say, I can't go in public. I can't go to the grocery store. I got to find somebody to stay with my kid. We have a meltdown every time I go into public and I can't function. Well, think of how disruptive that is, that we can't function in public. Okay, I almost hate giving handouts for this next slide because it says how many sensory systems does our body have, but then right below it, it gives you the answer. So I think when we first did this presentation, we didn't realize that we gave the answer away before we asked the question. So we were shocked when someone shouted out the answer, but you look on the handouts and there you have it. So we're going to go through all these sensory systems. Most people know our very basic ones, the vision, the hearing, the smells, the taste. But we're going to talk a little bit about our interoceptive one, which is a less known. I'm just curious, how many people of you know what interoception is? Yes, I can teach something new. That's a good one. And that's a one we are starting to teach a lot more to these kids. So our sensory systems, the auditory system, which is our hearing, the olfactory system, which is our smell, oral, tactile, which is our touch, visual. Anybody know what vestibular is? This is our balance and our coordination. So a lot of times, how many of you have clumsy kids? Yep. This is that. This is the kids that are uncoordinated, clumsy, running into things. Anybody know what proprioceptive is? This one is like our body's ability. How many of you have rough kids? Kids that run into things, kids that don't maintain personal space and boundaries. These are our kids who are running into everything, crashing into everything, jumping off everything, have no safety awareness. This is their body's input into their joints. And so this is where they get that input. And then interoception is our body's internal awareness. This affects our feeding. This affects a lot of time for these kids, their bowel and bladder. So a lot of your kids that probably have toileting issues, and just this emotional regulation issues, dysregulation type things. This is that interoception and like that self-awareness of our ability to feel what we feel. So then the next slide is all individuals learn from sensory experiences, even when there are active motor movements. The information coming into the central nervous system is sensory. Neuroplasticity guidance allows for correction, alteration, and success in gross and fine motor behaviors. Repetition, instruction, and practice. So this is why in therapy we work to identify all these areas that we have problematic. We have specific assessments for these sensory areas so we can pinpoint where these kids are becoming dysregulated and where we may have areas of need. And so we work to target those areas by practice, repetition, to strengthen those connections in those kids who probably don't have them coming right out of the bat after birth. So let's talk about them. We'll go into more detail. Like I said, if you guys have any questions along the way, please, I'm very informal. Please, you can either save them to the end, or if you want me to answer along the way, we can go along the way. So let's start with our auditory one. Okay, this is our sense of hearing, obviously, and how the body receives and processes sound. Anybody have any ideas of what this might look like in dysregulation of kids? Okay. Our biggest one that we see in our kids who are sensory sensitive to the auditory is when they go out in public or they hear loud noises, it's instantly the hands over the ears. That's our biggest one where we get kids very overwhelmed if people can't go into public with these kids. The very telltale for a lot of kids is the hands over the ears. And this can come we had a kid and I'm a normally loud talker. For all of you that know me, I do not have a soft volume, unfortunately. But we noticed this in the last kid that we autism tested. I was talking to her and asking her if she was ready to go, and she went like this. And so it was kind of my cue that I'm like, well, crud, darn it. And we turned out fine. It was just sometimes they startle very easily with sound. Also, what happens with these kids with auditory processing things is they misinterpret their information heard. They don't necessarily know how to react to the sounds that they hear or what they're hearing and what to do with it. Hypersensitivity is that hands over the ears, or kids who withdraw from crowds. A lot of kids who play by themselves or act out in public, they tend to be a little bit more on the sensory sensitive side, and they'll cover their ears. That's our biggest one. Some kids will be like, you're too loud or it's too loud. We had a fire happen in our office today, I guess. And so that was I heard it was a lot of kids walking out with hands over the ears. And I said, the fire marshal, when he came in to test last year, goes, my wife's a special ed teacher. Maybe we should consider getting you guys silent fire alarms to be sensitive to your kids' needs. And I'm like kudos, thank you for thinking of our kids. I said, you know what though, if we're sitting in a treatment room and there's a fire, we're not going anywhere because we can't see those. And so when Rena and I were talking about it today, we know that those are problematic areas for kids, that they're sensitive, but we also realize there's real life. So we need these kids to desensitize to some of those sounds. Like there's no school that has silent fire alarms, or no store that has silent fire alarms. So we do have kids that suffer with where it could actually be a safety issue for their sensitivity. So we work with them along the path because it is a safety concern as well. Then we also have the hyposensitivity to these sounds. We have kids who don't respond. And what this looks like sometimes in the beginning when kids don't respond to sound is people go down the road of autism. Like if they don't hear or respond to their name, people are like, oh, I think they're autistic. Well, that's not necessarily true. They could just have just be that low functioning in their sensory system that they need. These are the kids that you have to talk to and talk to and talk to, and they don't look and finally like yelling. And they're like, why are you yelling? Well, you didn't respond. Or the kids that you tell not to run across the street and they're running across the street until you shout your lungs out at them before they finally respond. If they respond, that is. But there are kids that will function on the other side of it. Most of the time we think on the high side, the hyperactivity and otherwise, but like I said, sometimes these kids that function on the low side get missed, but we need to watch them too, because there could be a deficit in those low functioning kids as well. They talk loud. This is why we ask our families when we do our intakes, has their hearing been checked? Most families are like, the number one answer, I love the number one answer, the selective count. Yes, because these kids, sometimes we have to talk and talk and talk and they don't listen, but there could actually be a underlying sensory concern where they don't respond appropriately to hearing their name or responding to when you ask them questions, which looks like ignoring and misbehavior, but actually could be like an underlying sensory problem as well. And not responding when their name is called. We talked about that. I don't know. I'm curious. I like this question. Is there anybody that hears a weird noise in here that is bothersome to them? Some of our kids will hear the lights. So some of these kids that are so sensitive, like if we actually let the room go really quiet, some people can hear, I don't know, is there anybody that's super sensitive in here? Yeah. And then it becomes, well, we just selectively tune it out now. So I had a kid, I like to give this example. I had a kid, we were sitting doing treatment at his house and he's like, here comes the train, Krisann. And I'm like, what? 3 minutes later, the train came by. So some of these kids can actually hear asininely long distances before, I mean, it was a good 3 minutes. It had to have been before that train came by. And I'm like, how did you hear that? So we take for granted what these kids hear. This can become problematic in households, but this becomes really problematic in community settings. But it also becomes very problematic in school, because where these kids maybe are hearing somebody across the room scratching a eraser, somebody's hearing someone tapping a foot. Sensory is very hard because you can't see it. You can see Down syndrome, you can see cerebral palsy, you can see shaken baby, you can see TBIs, but you cannot see the sensory thing. These kids look pretty typical. And so what it typically presents like is a behavioral problem where these kids are really trying to focus through. They said the lights are a really big complaint on our kids because they said that the old lights used to hum. So a lot of our kids were hearing the lights and nobody had any idea that they were hearing these because most of us don't hear it or tune them out. So this is a really big one, that the kids become overly sensitive to sound. And you think about the kids that you see for trauma, it becomes like a safety concern for them. You know, all of their senses become extremely heightened and they become extremely aware of their surroundings. But again, you can't see it. So this is a really big one to those kids who are having trouble focusing, paying attention, and otherwise is either they're not responding or they're over responding to sounds, whether it be to voices or whether it be to other sounds they hear in their environments. Mm-hmm. It's weird when you get the mixed thing. It's really weird when you get the mixed thing. Another thing we see with those kind of kids is that they are super over respondent to like big crowds or even things that like radios in the car, and they'll be like, it's too loud. But you're like, you will go and you will yell or you will make sounds and you will like scream and it doesn't bother you, or somebody else, or the radio goes up or they're banging musical instruments. It sometimes seems like they regulate themselves based on, and sometimes it's really hard with those when you get that hyper versus the hypo, because sometimes I think they shut them, especially with our kids with trauma, I think they shut themselves out to, if they're overregulated, a lot of our kids will shut down and just not respond. So it gets really, really tricky when you see both sides of that spectrum. Yep.
And when it's noisy, then he shuts down all the time.
I think sometimes when they go to make their own noises, it's their control. I think it becomes a control thing where they're like, I don't like the fact that I can't control what sound you have coming out or what situation I'm in. But if it's quiet and I'm going to make my own noise, I can control my own regulation because it's so internal that they regulate themselves. But it's kind of that one that makes you go, I don't get it.
Noticed it for sure was when he came in here, the church.
Mm.
And when we went up into the top bleachers, which is where we all love to sit. And it was, first of all, entering and seeing that there was that many people there was overwhelming. Then getting up there and coming back down again was too much. But then once we started to leave, he got louder and louder as he went out.
Was he getting more comfortable? Do you think?
He has been, but then this
Mhm.
last time we came, he was back to almost to where he was before when he first started coming. So
And that becomes really, really hard because the sensory system is so internal that to try and figure out what's regulating these kids are so hard.
Yeah.
Cause it's like, most of the time it becomes about control. Like if I can control what noise I'm making, I can regulate myself. But other people like, you're just as loud as like I was. And so that's where we start to teach these kids, okay, because we do have a lot of kids that'll make sounds, weird sounds, or just yelling or singing. And so then we start to teach the appropriateness of where we should do those sounds. Because it's some sort of regulation. It's just, it is a never guessing or like a never ending guessing game of what is making them tick in that auditory thing, what's too overwhelming and what's not enough. Good? Anybody else? That's a really hard one. And the sensory system gets really hard with that. It's like I said, never ending guessing game to try and figure out what regulates these kids, which it's a 50-50. We try it. And if it doesn't work, we try something else. So we move on. And that's the auditory one's hard because none of us are immune from sound unless we're locked in a box. We also find that these kids with trauma that are left alone, become overly sensitive to that auditory piece. Like if they're left alone and quiet in their rooms by themselves, they struggle with that noise piece and readjusting to that noise. But that's why we always start too with, has their hearing been tested, just to make sure that there's no physical reason for why these kids are sensitive. Okay, so let's move on to the olfactory, the sense of smell. This is one we don't always think about. So when we see problems with the olfactory and the smell system, we see the hypersensitivity, these kids that seem to shy away from things. These are our kids that gag or throw up with certain foods. We see this a lot in our feeding kids. And so anybody have a guess how many steps there are to eating? I love giving this fun fact. I mean, we're talking about the smell, but this is a part of it. There are 32 steps to eating, if you can believe that. So from the time that food is smelled, like even before it's put on a plate and eaten. So there's from the beginning to the very end where we chew and swallow, there's 32 steps. And this is one of the big ones. This is where we start because some kids, I've had kids that we've worked with that have had to walk out of the house because they can't stand the smell of what they're smelling, which in turn affects their eating. So we have kids who will smell food and throw up. A lot of times, this is the big time we see them with meal times. We do try and be very, very cautious about what we wear for our deodorants and our perfumes and therapy because we also realize with trauma kiddos, we realize that certain scents can trigger, an abuser or a certain situation where these kids that we may not even know. We may not even know exist until we get there. And that's one of those things that may set them off and we don't like when there appears to be no rhyme or reason, there could be a smell that sets them off. But a lot of times we see this with our kids with feeding. Any of you guys have feeding problematic kiddos? We see a lot of feeding kids through our clinic. And so we don't tend to see a lot on the hypo side of this one. We tend to see more on the hyper side of this one. A lot of our kids will smell, but they become very sensitive to the smell. This is very hard, also a very hard one to like avoid because wherever you go, there's smells of certain kinds. So these kids will smell anything. And these are the ones that you may think you put deodorant on in the morning. They're like, you stink. So like they're very, very sensitive to the smells of things. We have kids that will smell. Anybody have kids that will smell everything? So we got a lot of these kids that'll put things, sometimes it even ends up the nose, which is like, no, you can't do that. That's problematic. But a lot of our kids, this is how we find our way around the world, is we start to smell, then we start to put it in our mouth. So that sense of smell is very, very strong. So our fun fact for this one is our olfactory system is heavily related to our limbic system, which is a part of our nervous system that is responsible for emotions and memory. So again, why we become very, very sensitive to some of these like silent systems is because it, especially for kids with trauma, but a lot of our kids in general with sensory, we don't know what triggers them for smell or sight or sound. And so a lot of these systems trigger that memory and those emotions. A lot of our sensory systems trigger our emotions. And then we'll move on to the oral section. This is the input via our mouth and our jaws. Obviously, everybody knows this. Anybody have kids that eat things, stick things in their mouths? These are the kids that are putting things that they shouldn't put in their mouths. A lot of our kids will put everything in their mouths but the food they're supposed to eat. So this becomes problematic, but this is how we get it. This gets our taste, our temperature, and our texture of our food. The movement of the mouth, speech, sounds, and control of our saliva. We see a lot of kids with oral type concerns. So our hypersensitivity in these kids, they choke or they gag easily. Even this could even be on toothbrushes. And so these are the kids that are super sensitive to anything in their mouth and things in the placement of their mouths. We see a lot of these with picky eaters, is their sensitivity. So these are the kids that refuse to brush their teeth, refuse or struggle really strongly at the dentist, but also are really, really picky eaters, sensitive to the texture, the taste, or the temperature of their foods. We do see sometimes where this can develop. That's also the kind of tricky part about some of our sensory systems. It's never the same. It changes day to day. I mean, none of us are regulated the same every single day. And so this changes from day to day as those kids regulate themselves, as we regulate ourselves. And so sometimes you'll see something, you're like, yes, my kid eats this. Now my kid won't eat this. And this is where it gets very tricky to determine if it's a sensory thing or if it's a behavioral thing or it's a both thing. That's where it gets really hard with these kids. And so a lot of times we see kids and the parents are like, well, they always used to eat this and now they don't eat it anymore. So sometimes those sensory sensitivities can develop as the kiddos get older, which is unfortunate because food is kind of a life or death thing. So we need to eat. But a lot of our kids, we had a kid down to peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and like cheese once. I mean, we had a kid down to eating 2 straight things. And so it's kind of a struggle for some of these kids if they're that sensitive in the mouth. The hyposensitivity ones, we see them biting. These are your biters sometimes. And then we have to tease out, is it a sensory thing or is it a communication thing? Because all of these could have multiple things, but we want to rule out the sensory. A lot of times our biters don't talk, and so we bite when we're angry. And toddlers don't know how to regulate themselves anyways. But you see them eating rocks. They see them chewing, eating on crayons, markers, dirt, sand, wood chips. We have a kid that eats wood chips. So now we have a big problem when we eat wood chips. Oh. To me, that just gives me the heebie-jeebie. Like, I get that texture in my mouth and I'm like, oh my word, like I can't even imagine, but whatever. They seek out things that they don't, that the rest of us be like, really? But like I said, most of these guys are the picky eaters that won't eat a chicken nugget or a noodle or things normal kids eat. Trying to bite others. This is another big one in our little ones. And so we try and determine whether it's a sensory thing where they're seeking out to bite or they just can't communicate well. They also overstuff their mouths. This is our kids that if you look at them, they look like they're going to choke. We always call them the chipmunk cheeks. So I had one kid go, I don't have chipmunk cheeks. I said, you have chipmunk cheeks. So then we really work with those kids because they can't feel in their mouths when their mouth is too full. And so what looks like some kids just rush to eat, again, with those trauma kiddos, a lot of times food, these kids have food trauma. And so now to tease out, is it a sensory thing or is it because kids have been deprived of food and they're just so hungry? I've worked with kids I had a 9-year-old go through the garbage for her cookie because she was so devastated that her cookie was going to be gone. And it's like, well, there's a whole nother box of Oreos in the cupboard, so we try and help you guys tease out the behavior type things versus the trauma things versus the sensory things. So this is where it gets a little tricky, but hopefully it'll give us some help to differentiate. But yeah, that's a big one. And that becomes a safety concern for choking. So just so to be aware that do you guys see kids that do kids have kids that do this, that overstuff, that just stuff their mouths so full that it just is like, spit it out before you choke. And I don't want to do the Heimlich today. Another thing that when we see with these hyposensitive type things is goes along with the eating, but also goes with toileting. Our hyposensitive kids tend to like all of a sudden stop and run to the bathroom because their bladder has to get so full that they all of a sudden run. So these kids are like under responsive for a lot of things. But like I said, with the oral one, it's usually the grooming and the hygiene of the teeth. They don't want their teeth brushed, or it's typically feeding, or the kid that chews everything. That is a problem too. So then we get into, is it a sensory thing or is it an oral motor thing? So I actually went and took a training on this because we were getting a lot of droolers. And I don't think some of those kids, when we talk about the hyposensitivity, there's kids that won't recognize that their face is messy. You know, so we got these kids that with this face messy and they won't wipe. We have the kids that are hypersensitive that'll wipe everything. They can't tolerate their face being messy, but we have some kids who you could have a whole pie on their face and they would never know. So we do look for that too in that, but the drooling, some kids don't know that they drool. Some kids do know that they drool, but it could be an oral motor thing. So I took a training on oral motor strengthening because in OT, they teach us about the sensory part. They don't teach us about the strengthening part in the mouth, which is huge, huge for speech, huge for eating, huge for just that mouth hanging open. And so we work that muscle back up, but it can be a sign of hyposensitivity when they don't know that they're drooling, or if they really can't just pull their mouth back up, then it becomes a whole nother bear cat. But a lot of them don't know that they're even doing it. So you see these kids, I have one I'm working with right now, she has no clue. She could have her whole mouth full of saliva out and she would have no idea. And so to work with them on getting that awareness back into their mouth, because it affects people, like for her, she's 5, but it's affecting her socially now because the other kids are like, I don't want to play with you because you're drooling all over my toys. Well, and that becomes problematic for health and sanitation because now I'm drooling over everything and it's gross. It's gross. Most of the time it smells because these kids don't like their teeth brushed either. And so, I mean, you get a whole gamut of things that just becomes problematic, but the drooling can be either a sensory and not awareness thing, or it can be a oral motor strengthening thing. Because that's a big one. We're getting these kids that are just hang their mouths open. They'll even walk around with their mouths open and you're like, shut your mouth. Or the kids that like chew, that really like just have no awareness of their mouth. So then we get into oral motor parts too, which is fun. We get to mix sensory with motor parts and strengthening. It's a good time when you get all of the above. However, some of those strengthening exercises will bring input back into the mouth. You know, when you look at these kids that are drug addicted, alcohol, fetal alcohol, preemies, babies born via C-section, we see a lot of kids with a lot of mixture, a lot of times of the hyposensitivity for that kind of stuff. So, and that muscle tone. I just took a training in a TheraSuit. It's like a strengthening program. And she goes, I don't see any kids with core strength anymore. So they look at the core strength of our kids coming up, there are none. And so if we have no core strength in this, we don't have core strength in our leg, or we don't have strength in our legs, we don't have strength in this, we really don't have strength in this. I mean, this is your slouchers, your kids that prop themselves out, the kids that are hanging over things. I mean, when we go to look at this, there's a lot of core strength issues that go along with these sensory systems too, that we have to just tighten up absolutely everything. Great. So let's go on to anybody else have any questions on the oral part of it? That's a big one. We see a lot of this through our clinic on a daily basis. So let's talk about the tactile system. This is our sense of touch. This is our clothes. This is if somebody touches us. Different pressures, temperatures, textures, and tractions on our skin. It helps us feel pain. And our receptors for our tactile system are all over our body. That, like, our skin is our biggest organ. And so, you know, those receptors are absolutely everywhere. Does anybody have a kid that they touch and that kid like rubs their arm? Like, this is always kind of a fascinating one, that if I go up and touch somebody, they're like, so our hypersensitive ones, so this is a problem with our tactile system. If somebody touches them, these kids will often like rub. they'll go in and they'll rub or they'll grab their arm or they'll yell at you and say that hurts. And you're like, I just touched you, like even to get their attention. And so these kids are super, super sensitive sometimes in their skin. These are the kids that if a kiddo in line brushes up against them, they're going to go and slug that kid probably because they think that kid punched them on purpose. In fact, we had a kiddo get in a fist fight here not too long ago because he goes, he pushed me. What happened is the kid tripped over somebody else's shoe, knocked into the kiddo, and the kiddo goes, you pushed me, and slugged him in the nose. So some of our kids, yeah, I mean, we see and that it triggers really aggressive sometimes responses, especially in our little boys, it seems like. But some of these kids are so sensitive that even if you brush them, they're thinking you punched them. So this is something to be super considerate of our super conscious of in like lines with our kids who seem to be just kind of, I can't stand in line. They look hyperactive, but some kids really just feel that touch on their skin, even if it's covered by clothes, way too much. And so we try and treat these with the brushing protocol. If anybody's used the Will Barger brushing protocol, it's a surgical brush. It's a brushing protocol done on the skin with joint compressions to help give them and desensitize that skin. Because sometimes we get these really super aggressive responses when really there is no aggressive response is required. So you can imagine how well our social interactions go for some of these kids when this happens, where it could just be a brush of the skin, a touch of the arm, a touch of the leg, or it could be a complete accident and these kids blow up. And so these are kids like we talked about with the hypersensitivity. They don't like their face messy. They don't like their hands messy. Sometimes when we go back in this, these kids won't ever go barefoot. So when we look at especially some of our feeding kids, they will not go barefoot. So our hands, our feet, and our mouth are all connected. So typically if your feet or your hands are sensitive, your mouth is going to be sensitive. And so we really look at that whole bottom up approach to where a lot looked at just that, okay, my kid's not eating, they're gagging. Okay, will they get their hands messy? Well, no, not really. They won't finger paint. They won't do those other things. Okay, how about their feet? Will they go barefoot? Well, no, they don't go barefoot. Okay, so we're sensitive all the way up. So we got to tackle some of those tactile sensory things. This one presents primarily in our grooming and hygiene tasks. These are the kids that don't like to brush their teeth. They don't like their face washed. They don't like baths. They don't like showers. They don't like the water on their head. So these are our kids who will fight bathing too. They will fight your dentist. They don't like their grooming. They don't like their hygiene tasks because it's very sensitive, especially when you get in the head. We get a lot of ones that won't wash their hair. Is it because they just don't like the water in their face, or is it because kids are really sensitive? We get a lot, especially sometimes our girls who don't like their hair brushed. You can go and brush a kid's hair and they're like, you're hurting me. This hurts. It feels like somebody told one of the therapists, it feels like my head's on fire. Like we were lucky enough to have a girl that could tell us what it felt like when somebody brushed her hair. I'm like, can you imagine like someone brushing your hair and you think your head's on fire? Like, so it's very things that we don't normally think about for our kids. They're super sensitive on that scalp as well. The hyposensitivity ones are we call them our personal space invaders. They're the ones that have no personal boundaries, no personal space. They're in everybody's business. They love to be touched. They're giving hugs to absolutely everybody. They'll go find Joe Schmo across the street and be like, hey, we're best friends. So these are your ones that have those inappropriate social boundaries too, or are always coming and giving you hugs. They're always touching you. And you're like, please just give me 5 minutes to not be touched. This is always entertaining when we have somebody who doesn't like a tactile sensitive person and then a tactile like hypersensitive kid or hyposensitive kid. It makes for a good combination sometimes because we get those and they're like, I don't want to be touched and they always touch me. Well, there we go. So, and they have to touch everything. These are the kids that you take to the store and they're dragging their hands along the lines and in the shelves and they're knocking things off and they're putting things in your cart and you go out in public and they're touching people and they're touching things and you're like, please stop. So these are your ones that just go above and beyond to touch absolutely everything. We had a girl that came in and started licking our carpets. she came into the clinic one day and our waiting room was licking the carpets and I'm like, okay, then. So like laying herself and rubbing herself on the carpets and licking the carpets. I'm like, yes, we have some work to do. A lot of it.
Hold on.
I know you said when they're like hypersensitive, like if they're sensitive with hands and feet, then usually they're oral sensitive.
Mhm.
Is the same though if they like touching things? Because I usually don't see the correlation with that. Like if they love to touch, they're still a picky eater.
It can be separate.
Okay.
And you know what? If it's separate, we're 10 steps ahead.
Okay, perfect.
Because then we don't have to tackle the feet and the hands.
Yeah.
Because if we have to tackle the feet and the hands that they're sensitive on, we have to tackle it all, but that's a bonus if they're not, if they will like that messy. Because some of our kids, like I take, for example, our kids who don't like messy play won't eat like the slippery, slimy, the mashed potatoes, the noodles. But if they are, we can at least, there's a step in there that they'll actually touch their food. So if we can actually have them tolerate, that's a bonus for us because they'll actually touch the textures. So we messy play with food, which parents absolutely love of us. You know, the going rule that you shouldn't play with your food. Well, we do it and sometimes it translates into not a really good thing at home. But if we can get them to actually not be sensitive, that's wonderful. It's one less step we have to tackle. And then we can typically get them, because kids will naturally, if you get their hands messy, I feel like they naturally have a tendency to put it in their mouths. So that's a bonus if they're not sensitive down, like on anything else. I love it when that happens. Anybody else on the tactile part? Oh, this is also, I forgot, our hypersensitive ones are the ones who will only wear sweatpants or leggings, won't wear jeans, have their favorite shirt, want things too loose, don't want things tight, or want things too tight. So they're very sensitive in their clothing too, which becomes problematic for parents. Some of them won't leave their shoes and their socks on, which also becomes problematic because we have winter here 6 months a year or 9 months a year. So when we get into that clothing thing, that's also a big thing. They're very picky about their clothing and how their clothing feels. That's a really big one for a lot of our kids. And it does a lot of them where they seek out to. And a lot of our trauma kids have a lot of these sensory things. And it's sometimes very hard to tease out what a sensory thing is versus what a trauma response and attachment thing is. So we kind of treat it as a whole package and we kind of muddle through that on an individual basis with parents, families, and the kids themselves. So we would rather have people not try and like separate that because sometimes even we can't separate that. But hey, if we can be a good resource to try and help you tease through some of those things and give strategies, that's wonderful. If we can be a help in that way. Okay, our visual system, this obviously is our eyes. This receives and processes our input through our eyes, and our brain is what identifies the object and gives it meaning. So when we talk about visual, we do ask this in our intake if kids' eyes are fine. This is where we start just to make sure there's no issue with structurally with these kids' eyes. So then once we get past this, it gets a little more tricky because if we ask this and people are like, well, their eyes are fine. Okay, their eyes are fine, but there's a whole nother system that takes in what we get. And so this is also one of those like the auditory that we don't typically think about on a regular basis with our kids. Okay, go into a kindergarten classroom and what does it look like? Our preschool classrooms, what do they look like? They're colorful, they're bright, they're busy, a lot of stuff. So our kids with visual processing difficulties, they're easily distracted by colors or the activities in the environment. So when you go into a preschool, you go into a classroom, there's a lot of things, a lot of places. And so these kids just can walk into a room and automatically be gone. You know, they'll shut down sometimes before people even realize it. And again, not one that they necessarily act out to. You don't necessarily get a big reaction to these kids shutting down, being hypersensitive to what it looks like. And a lot of our kids can't tell us, like they can't tell us what, like they can't say, well, this room is too busy or the noise is too loud. So that is one of them. This is one of the kind of those silent ones that can cause a trigger and overstimulation without necessarily having a large reaction or can cause a large reaction. This also looks like our kids who are inattentive, who don't pay attention, who are often la la land, not paying attention and not focusing to what they need to be doing. They're distracted by everything else going on. You know, whether it be kids moving in the classroom, whether it be the books on the shelf, the toys that are around. the things on the floor. They just get really easily distracted, which also looks like sometimes ADHD. You know, so all of these things can have a different presentation, and people are quick to go to pediatricians, doctors sometimes go to, this is ADHD, this is ODD, this is OCD, this is autism, you know, where there could be a whole underlying factor of these issues. Our hyposensitivity ones are the ones that stare at the same point for a really long time. You know, we tell our kids don't stare because it's rude. Well, they stare because they're trying to process what it is, and they're just taking that much longer. That's the thing about some of these sensory things, is they take out, these hyposensitive ones take that much longer. And so what they're staring at is they're trying to process that information. It's just taking them a lot longer. And they quickly become confused during visual activities. We see this as a really big problem in school with our kids who are having a tough time with homework, not doing homework, fighting their homework. We don't pick this up as quickly in our littler kids, but we pick it up once they start having to do things in school. So our kids who aren't starting their homework, aren't doing their worksheets, aren't starting an activity at all. Sometimes we have to look at what's their homework being presented to them. You know, are there 50 math problems on a page? Okay, so these kids become so overwhelmed by what, you know, they may look at this page and be like, not happening. So these are kids who teachers like, they won't start anything. You know, they just become so overwhelmed and shut down. And they become really confused. They don't know where to start on some of these things. So especially if there's a lot going on their pages, or if they're given puzzles, those kind of things, or any other visual activity that they might be having to do. This is one of those that is not based on the structure of the eye. It's based on that vision system, which is, we have to do. And I feel like we have to do a better job of like talking to families about the difference between like what eye doctors do and what vision can do. We have one therapist in our office who's well versed in the visual. She's had a lot of extra training in the visual skills, so she takes a lot of our vision and has collaborated well with our actual doctors in town for referrals, because vision therapy isn't covered sometimes, but she can help address some of these visual processing difficulties that we have. One to go missed, because most people are like, well, my kid's eyes got checked, we're fine. Not necessarily. So when we go to look through all of these, we look at them and we look at all these areas to make sure there's not a deficit in one. And then our vestibular one, this is our balance and our movement. All of you have clumsy kids. Some of you have clumsy kids. We see a lot of these in our kids with, like a lot of our trauma kids, a lot of our kids with sensory issues. These are the kids that are running into things. These are the kids that aren't playing on the playground very well. They're falling, they're running and falling, but with no reason to be falling. Well, I guess I can't ask that question. Gee, I should take some of these out. Our balance system is actually in our right ear. Did anybody know that? It's a cool system. That's a vestibular system in our ears. So when we have ear infections, when we have other problems, our vestibular system can be affected by that. And it's also associated with our spatial awareness, which is our body awareness with other people. These are also our space invaders. And the gravitational security, the kids that won't go up and down stairs well, the kids that won't go up and down curbs well. I had a little girl, we have a little foam wedge today, and she sat down. I mean, this wedge is probably this high off the ground, and she had to sit down because she was so unstable to even go down this little foam wedge, though it was not but a little bit off the floor. So some of these kids are they're the kids that won't swing, they're the kids that won't play on the playground, they're the kids that are really clumsy or would just rather sit. But they're the ones that also walk with that high guard position that are like toddlers do when they're learning to walk. So they'll walk with their arms out to try and balance, because they're not functioning well in their vestibular system. Our hypersensitivity ones are ones that are running around like crazy, just super, super clumsy. The ones that come with bumps and bruises constantly because they just have no coordination whatsoever. Our hyposensitive ones are the ones that won't go up and down stairs without holding onto a railing or someone's hand. They won't go up and down curbs. They won't change positions in where they walk. And so we work on that as well. And the vestibular system goes alongside the visual system. So there's concerns with both. So we try and rule out one before the other. And then our proprioceptive system, these are the receptors are in our joints and our muscles. We do a lot of joint compressions with our kids because this is where they get their most input. This are those kids. This system helps us identify our body position and our movement, and it's our ability to adjust our force. So the kids that run like 100 miles a minute into the wall or into somebody else, a lot of times they won't pick something to jump into, they'll pick a person. So these kids that'll run, a lot of times they're seeking out that really deep input into their joints. Most of the time we don't see kids doing this to be brutal or mean or manipulative or malicious. It's more just the hyperactive, hard. They don't realize how hard they're moving and they just seek that extra input into their joints. These are also the kids like when they're writing or doing coloring will break their crayons, break their pencils because they write so hard. And they just can't judge that amount of force into their bones, into their joints. So again, this is what we look at as our rough kids. They cannot adjust their own, they can't adjust their own force of movement with how they act. This also becomes problematic with kids when they play with other kids. You know, especially if they're younger kids, when they're barreling over these little kids, because they just don't know. I mean, we have little 3-year-olds getting in trouble in daycare because they're pushing kids and running over kids and they just have no idea. And some of these kids are really big, you know, so they don't know their size, let alone their force on someone else. They also present as weak or clumsy kids. They have poor posture. So they'll lean, slump, or fall out of their chairs. They're crashing or falling constantly. They'll take a lot of safety risks. These are kids that'll jump off of playgrounds. They'll jump off of, you know, they'll jump off of chairs. They just have no concern for their own safety or for anybody else's for that matter. And then our interoception, this is our internal. This is from inside the body related to the body and the internal organs. This is becoming way more known about, talked about, and dealt with in the OT world and just known in general that these kids really have no awareness of their own internal systems, you know, where most of us don't think twice about if we have to go to the bathroom, our bladder feels full, we go. You know, some of our kids who are problematic, they can't feel their bladder, they don't take the time to feel their bladder. This is a big thing with potty training. A lot of kids that don't potty train well. This includes our respirations, our heartbeats, our bowel and bladder, and then our receptors are all over our body for this one. You know, that we have to work the whole system for this. Eyes, ears, nose, mouth, stomachs. You know, this is our kids who don't know that they're hungry. You know, so we'll have kids that'll say they're mad, but really they're hungry. So this is a process for us to work with these kids. Do you have to go to the bathroom? Do you have to eat? Are you thirsty? So we work with kids to go through that checklist of how does your internal body feel? And then this has that body emotion connection. We joke about being hangry. You know, a lot of us feel hangry if we're tired, or if we're thirsty. So problems with this: poor emotional control. A lot of times they don't even know what's happening within their own body. Bowel and bladder control difficulties. I would say this is what we have a big problem. We have a lot of referrals for bowel and bladder because our kids won't potty train. Alexithmia is poor perspective or coping skills. This also, a lot of these skills come from that just poor awareness of ourselves because we can't work well with others if we don't work well and understand ourselves. Eating or feeding and not dressing appropriately for the weather. This I feel like plays a big part for us up here, where our kids will go out into 50 degree below weather with shorts and a t-shirt on, you know, just because they don't feel things the same way that a lot of us do. And so we work with a lot of kids on correct weather clothing because you can't go out into 50 below because you're going to get frostbite. But sometimes these kids, this goes alongside with some of that tactile with the temperature. Some of our kids will go touch a hot stove and not think twice. They'll burn and they still don't feel it. A lot of our kids have very high pain tolerances, and that looks like our hypo-responsive kids to hot bath water, like when we're washing our hands, it's too hot. Our food, sometimes we won't recognize if our food is too hot. And so we work through all these systems, connect very I've lost my word, but they work very closely with each other. They're all intertwined to do our sensory system. And so the next one is just kind of how we look at our development. And so we go back to the very, very bottom of our sensory system, which is our internal functioning system. And we realize that like at the very top is academic learning. So our kids who aren't doing well in school, we have to go all the way back. It's like the hierarchy of needs. You know, you need to you need to eat, you need to drink, you need to all that stuff before. So we start on the very bottom of the sensory system, and then we go into like our posture, our crossing midlines, our reflexes, and then we go into eye-hand coordination. There is a lot that comes before that academic learning. And so where a lot of our kids look like they're just being defiant and mean, there's oftentimes a lot of these systems below them that are not functioning well. And so our system on the bottom with the sensory input, because we take in sensory input all the time, that's our most important. And so that's what we work to address. But it's the part that goes oftentimes unaddressed, and it goes straight to behavioral. On the other side, I don't always love that everything is about sensory either, because I feel like it's either it's one hard side or the other. You know, you Google OT and you see sensory processing disorder. But that's not all it is either. So it's very intertwined, but this is a very big part of it. So the impact of trauma on self-regulation, there's a lot of things on self-regulation. You look at the kids that you guys get through that are neglected, that are abused. And so we look at all of that, and those, they are often lacking sensory input, or they just register it differently because of physical abuse or sexual abuse. So they register things a lot differently than we do. We also see difficulties in executive functioning, which is the planning, organizing, and flexibility. Decreased language, adaptive functioning deficits, a lot of these kids with no self-control. But oftentimes there's a lot of deficits in that underlying things too. Sleep disturbances, disruption of their sensory input. A lot of times these guys, if they're physically abused, we see this too, where they're overly sensitive to touch. They don't want to be touched because it's a harmful response to them. They're very, very quick to enter fight or flight, and they may seem stubborn or aggressive when really they just may be more than likely hypersensitive to touch, or to other sensory input. Challenges with perspective taking and understanding others. You know, if nobody cares about me, why should I care about anything else? So these deficits really do go into daily living, but as well as social. Hypoactivity, and then peer victimization and bullying. And then also we talked about the bowel and bladder. We see a lot of our kids, especially our kids with foster care, that have toileting issues. We're seeing a lot more kids in general with toileting issues these days, it seems like. So some tips and tricks to prevent tantrums or behavior. We really try, these kids are often very hyperactive. We try and make those wait times less miserable. So we use fidget toys. And I won't go through all of these. They're all written down there. So if you guys look through them and have any questions on them, we can go through them on an individual type basis. But our transitions for kids are really, really hard a lot of the times. They don't like to be stopped in what they're doing. And so we tend to use visual timers. We tend not to rush them, though we realize, you know what, sometimes urgency is necessary. So we work with them in therapy to get that flexibility. Again, going to that flexible thinking, working with them to learn to move a little bit faster and not so rigid on them having to finish things. But if we can, we allow them extra time between activities. And then consistency is big. We work on this a lot because we see how quickly it goes away when consistency isn't. You know, we have a lot of custody cases, even one of a typical family, where they go 2 weeks with mom and 2 weeks with dad. Dad and girlfriend are very, very consistent, very good about strategies. We go back to mom's, and it falls apart. And so now we have to go back and start over again. So we learn how hard it is to build up that tolerance, but how quickly it can go away when we don't use consistency with our kids. Distractions. A lot of times for our kids, they get very anxious. And so we try and give them, okay, I want you to take 2 or 3 more bites of your food. Give them actual clear expectations of when they can be done. Because kids seem to be very, very anxious and want to know when things are going to be done and when things are going to happen. And then we have to stick to it. Because how often, and I caught myself doing this too, like, oh, you know what? I want you to take 2 more bites. Oh, you took those 2 bites. Well, I'm going to make you take a third. Yeah, I can't. It's bad. And I fall in that habit once in a while. So I also have to train myself to be, you know, if I say 2, whether you do it well or whether you do it poorly, we stick to that. And then countdown cues. We tend to use verbal like verbal explanations of things, but a lot of our kids benefit from visual charts. A lot of them just need that extra visual to process, and some of our hyposensitive kids need that extra time to think about it. Like you could do your morning routine every day, but they're still going to need extra because they just can't process even those simple routines. So visuals are really helpful for that. Calming activities for community outings, since this becomes a very big problem. For our auditory kids, we use headphones a lot. Headphones or earbuds to help drown out the noise so the kids can go. Shoot, I feel like I see a lot of adults walking around with headphones in these days, even so helping provide some of those auditory, it reduces the auditory so they can function better. If you want to go to the store, put the headphones on, and we can function maybe a little bit better because our auditory stimulation is down. Some kids will wear sunglasses if like the store, there's a really good video. I should send it to you guys. They actually do like a sensory experience of someone, I think with autism in a Walmart. It's bizarre. If you guys haven't seen it, it's absolutely insane. So they go through and they actually show the amplification of like the sound and what it looks like from a perspective of a person with a disability. It's very fascinating, kind of scary to think about, where most of us can walk in and function. But if we can reduce those distractions and otherwise, we give our kids like gum or mints or fidgets. So we do that a lot. Headphones, a timer. Sometimes we use a timer, but that becomes problematic when we don't know how long it's going to take or if we have to stand in the checkout line at Walmart for way longer than we anticipate. So if your timer goes off, you're screwed. Because then the kid's like, well, you said I'm done, yet you're like 5 in line from the end of the line. So sometimes that's not always a good thing, but sometimes it works. And then the activities to assist with regulation. So the next slides just go through. I'll just let you guys kind of go through, but like auditory, we use a lot of that. The kids that regulate themselves with their sounds, we try and go off of the sounds to help desensitize them to like normal outings and things. The singing and the humming, blowing whistles. I do not give my kids whistles. It's a good strategy, but I don't like it because it becomes annoying real fast to a lot of people. And then we have a program that we don't actually have in our clinic. We don't have anyone trained, but it's called therapeutic listening. So what it does is it desensitizes kids to different sounds and actually will train their auditory system. I have a couple CDs called Soundies that we use to transition kids into daily life skills. Olfactory, like again, we use this a lot with our food. We'll actually have the kids help us prep the food so they start to get used to the smells, or we'll, have them stand at the door. We try and gradually work them in. We don't have any at this moment in time that are super sensory sensitive, but we have to work through that. I had a kid who's like, well, that smells funny. I said, I had something that smelled funny, but tasted really good. So we try and use that at verbal encouragement. Sensi, I use a lot of Sensi buddies, Sensi pal, the little Sensi balls. So we use some of those extra scents to help desensitize that olfactory system. You can use essential oils. There's a program that you can use, and you can use that to help desensitize things as well. But just providing them a whole opportunity to smell a lot of different things, scratch and sniff stickers, blindfolding them. We'll sometimes blindfold them if the kid can take it, blindfold them and have them guess what the smell is, which could be very traumatic for some kids, but we try and do it if the kids can tolerate it. Activities to assess with regulation. We use a lot of different textures for kids. We blow bubbles. We typically will recommend kids suck things like pudding or applesauce, things you typically wouldn't, through a straw. So that gives them that extra input. We use gum a lot. Chewies, vibrating toothbrushes. We use a lot of thick liquids, milkshakes, smoothies, those kind of things to help. And we'll also do activities that involve blowing out of a straw. So that'll help get them that oral input without being too terribly disruptive, and they're not chewing on things that they shouldn't do. Tactile, we just provide them with a whole lot of, we finger paint with finger paints, we finger paint with mud, we finger paint with dirt, we finger paint with Play-Doh, we finger paint with foam and all the things. We also finger paint with food. We do a lot of finger painting with applesauce, pudding, yogurt. So any of our kids who are problematic with their tactile system will help maybe work into their mouths. We do a lot of weighted equipment to help give some input. And we also do that brushing protocol that is supposed to help desensitize their skin. But any chance we get to these kids to get that tactile input, the better. And more appropriate tactile. We use compression vests and weighted vests to help kids who like to crash into people, or compression shirts. We use that equipment as well to try and get kids to not do that and give them the input that they need. Visual, we work at like picture books, sunglasses outdoors, but we'll actually have people go into stores with sunglasses on. Like if the kids can't stand the visual, we give them sunglasses. We're also trying this with a kid who didn't want to poop because it looked gross. So we thought it was a sensory thing. And I mean, it is kind of a sensory thing, but it wasn't what I thought it was. At first I thought it was because he couldn't sit on the toilet. Then it turned into the smell. Then it turned into the look. And so I had to go and like, why don't we use smells in the bathroom? Why don't we use sunglasses? And this kid, I mean, we're working on it. We're working on it. But I mean, just when you think you have one sensory system figured out, there's a whole nother one that turns around. So that visual system is very, very powerful. So we play I Spy with these kids and we use sensory bins to help them find things. Vestibular activities, swings, animal walks, a lot of rocking, rolling, a lot of hanging upside down. We really encourage the playgrounds at this time, you know, in the 3 months we can use them. But really encourage families to get out with these kids and get these kids moving. Our kids who need to move. I know rough play is hard, but some of these kids won't rough play or won't move their heads. And so we really encourage that, like wrestling for those kids. Riding bikes, swimming, and yoga is really good for these kids to get some of that extra input in. The proprioception with the force, massages, bear hugs, body socks. We use compression shirts. What I tell families to, if you have a really hyperactive kid, you put the word therapy in something and it's going to go up in price, as you all know. So what I say is go out to like Dan or Walmart or Dick's or Shields and buy like the swim shirts, and either buy them the size up or the size smaller. And that gives them their compression, aside from a therapy shirt that you have to pay 4 times as much for. So that helps. That's an easy, natural, daily thing that people can do to help give that input into their joints. Pushing and pulling, catching, riding bikes, somersaults, shoveling, and swimming. We love to give our kids who need this input chores, vacuuming, cleaning mirrors, cleaning floors, cleaning walls. You all get chores done and those kids get input. And most of them, you'd be amazed at how many of our kids love to vacuum. You put a vacuum on them and they love to vacuum because it's really good deep input, or mopping the floors or scrubbing the walls because it gets them, it gets their whole body moving, but it also gives them that deep input without the multi-purpose. Chores are really great for that deep pressure. It's awesome. And parents are happy because they get something done, you know, and they can put their kids to work. And then the interoception, we work on that emotional. Kendra had put in here bowel and organ massage. We do not do that. It is a thing. It is a real thing. So a lot of our kids with bowel and bladder problems actually do go for bowel and bladder treatment. And so I think there is, have you done it or like seen it? Yeah, I've heard it's a really unique experience. We do not do it in our clinic, but there are people that are trained that do it. And I heard that there is such a thing as bowel and organ massage, which it helps wake up those muscles. I don't know how they do it. So yeah, it's there's a real thing for bowel and bladder treatment. It is crazy. Has it been successful? Yes and no? Oh, well, and this is that whole interoceptive piece where they have to become aware, where you actually have to work those muscles that you don't normally see. And so it is a real thing. Yeah. Yeah. We do have a therapist that's going to go for bowel and bladder. Jess is actually going to go for bowel and bladder. Yep. She wants to go for bowel and bladder. I'm like, girl, it's all yours. Take it and run with it. I'm staying out of that. But then we really work on them, like personally identifying, okay, if we can see that they're hungry, okay, your stomach's growling. So we really work with them on identifying their own body. And then breath. We really work on breathing for these kids and then kind of explain it like this gives you oxygen to your brain. It gives you oxygen to your body. This is going to help us feel how we feel. So it's essentially getting our kids to slow down enough to recognize their own, because most adults don't know the sensory systems and how we feel sometimes. Now we're trying to get these kids to do it, especially when there's a plethora of things. So does anybody have any questions for me? I know I kind of buzzed through that. The sensory system thing is hard and lengthy. And like I said, it's not one you can see. But we just highly encourage if anybody has concerns or like goes back and looks through some of these things, please don't hesitate to reach out. I did bring cards with me or just reach out to anybody. Doesn't have to be me, doesn't have to be our clinic, just reach out to somebody. If you're finding that you might need help in some of these areas, because they are very big and especially for a lot of the kids you treat or you see and have in your houses.
I do have a question. So you're an OT standing up here talking about all of these, but if our kiddos are going to speech or physical therapy, would we find that those therapists are also trained and aware of some of this stuff where they might bring it into those therapies? Or is it mostly like we got to go see an OT?
They might recognize it. PT, I don't know. I feel like OTs are trained the most in the sensory component. I feel like you might get some speech therapists that would recognize some of the sensory things for like, because based on where you go for clinics, sometimes OTs do the feeding, sometimes speech therapists do the feeding. So it depends on where you go and who you have. They may not recognize the 8 systems, where PT might look at a kid. Let's take a kid who's clumsy. A PT might look at a kid who's clumsy and say, you're weak in the hips. You're weak in your feet. You're weak in your knees. They may address those things, but that kid still might be clumsy. I don't know their exact training route, but I don't know that they're as well trained or as thoroughly trained in the sensory systems of like the vestibular and stuff as like OTs are. So you may or you may not get.
I'm thinking about a kid I had that had every therapy except occupational therapy, and like all of these things that you're mentioning, this one, Amber, the drool coming out of his mouth, the clumsiness, the gagging at certain foods, like all this stuff. And thinking, oh my gosh, I wonder how much of that stuff was this stuff and not the stuff we thought it was.
Well, and you get speech who is very well trained in dysphagia or swallowing issues. So they may look at a feeding issue. We'll take a feeding issue. They may look at a feeding issue as a swallowing issue. However, if they try their dysphagia treatment and their swallowing treatment and they still don't have results, they may be like, there's something else. I mean, you may get therapists who try, but don't get anywhere. And maybe like, well, there might be another thing. I feel like
they didn't want to believe me when I said this isn't working.
And you guys know what works and what, okay, this is the thing, like, especially feeding therapy. Feeding therapy is not an overnight thing, and I wish it was. Unfortunately, it's also life and death. So that's a really hard one. But when it's not working, it's not working.
Yeah.
I had a little guy I just took on, and he was just turned 1. He was given to me for sensory, or for what they thought was sensory. He had a upper GI to a lower bowel done, and it was clear. We did the eval, and I said, have you had a swallow study done to make sure it's not reflex? Because she made it sound like he was projectile vomiting his solids. He's not moving to solids is why we got this kid. And I'm like, you had a swallow study done? She had one done within the week before I saw him the next time. Okay, that was clear. Okay, it's not really a speech thing. So then I started seeing him. Okay, we're going to treat for sensory, right? I think this kid's got a lip tie and a tongue tie. Guess what? Because when I first started seeing him, what we thought was a sensory problem, he's actually not spitting his food out. He is throwing up, but I think when I got to looking at him, he wasn't moving his tongue. He was tied under his tongue and he was tied right in between his teeth. And so I think what it was, where we started as a sensory endeavor, became an oral motor endeavor. Because I think his food would get back to his back of his mouth and his tongue couldn't move his food. And so what happens when we get our food back there? He couldn't swallow it. He couldn't move it. He couldn't chew it. He puked. So now we have a lip tie, the dentist said, and most of our pediatricians, just a heads up, we're finding this out. I didn't know this. 15 and a half years and I didn't know this. Apparently a lot of pediatricians are pushing through these kids with these ties, these lip ties, tongue ties, or the buccal cheek ties, and saying, nope, it's fine. They're going to outgrow it. Or they'll fall on their face. This was when I heard. They'll fall on their face and they'll break them naturally. And I'm like, why do I want my 1-year-old kid to fall on his face? Like now we're gonna have broken teeth and all these things. Like that's not cool. At any rate, so this is what happened. This kid got passed along by his pediatrician, though a good pediatrician in town. They said he's gonna be fine. Went to the dentist. Dentist goes, yep. And because it's affecting his eating, they're gonna clip him. You know, when it becomes a functional, especially for feeding. So what we think starts out as a sensory thing could be a sensory thing still, but I'm gonna see what happens when he gets these clipped in September. So when we find out things aren't working, we try something else. And so I think your speech therapist, if they try like they're swallowing and things and they don't work, I think then we start to move along to the OT route. But feeding between OT and speech can be intermixed wherever you go. At our clinic, it just happens to be our OTs are feeders. So when it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Other questions?
Please take the coasters. Those coasters, they go in your cup holder of your cars. And they keep your cup holders in your cars clean. Please take as many as you want. If you guys have any questions, please reach out to me, or anybody. Like I said, anybody. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be our clinic, but thank you guys for letting me come back.
Yeah.
This was a blast as
thank
always.
you. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah, so just a couple of things to wrap us up. July, we're not having a meeting that month. Enjoy your July. We are certainly going to enjoy it. August 13th is the picnic, so that's a picnic on us. All the food's provided, free amusement park wristbands for a couple hours in the amusement park for all of the kiddos in your home, foster and biological. And then if you have topics of interest, so September will be the first time we'll see you back here for a regular monthly meeting. If there are topics of interest that you're thinking, I'd love to learn about that, or just something has come up in your own household, those are oftentimes the best topics that we can find somebody to come in and talk. It's timely, it's relevant to you maybe and to many others. So let us know if you've got ideas. And then if you are at all interested in serving as an officer in the future for the association, you could also let me know. Paige is an officer, Leslie back there, Adam over here, who will take your membership dues. We're happy to share what that looks like and put you on a list for the next time we need new officers. So that's it. Enjoy your summer. Hope to see many of you in August, and please take your children with you this evening.